be honest, the Labor Party has used its allocation of speeches, so there are none left for the Labor opposition. No, you've used your full allocation, so I'm just bringing it to your attention. You have no more speakers for the rest of this debate. So I call Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I think I observed the same glint in the eye of the opposition spokesman for ACC, David Parker, as he had last week at the estimates review of ACC when he heard that the corporation had started to turn the corner financially and may have improved its financial performance to about a $2 billion result. And it didn't seem to me that Mr Parker's enthusiasm at that news was actually genuine applause for what I think has been an excellent turnaround in ACC, but it's more an indication to him and his colleagues that somehow it's okay now, that we can take the foot off the pedal in ACC performance, and that some of the steps that this government have taken weren't necessary. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, Mr Chairman, and it's worth remembering that at the time Mr Parker was last involved in a government that oversaw a result where ACC had $2 billion in it. It was a $2.4 billion deficit. And their response rather, was to make the corporation even more flaccid, particularly around rehabilitation rates. And the result for the following year was a $4.8 billion deficit. So while I'm really encouraged at the fact that ACC seems to be in the process of a turnaround plan, even if it's something like a $2 billion surplus, that needs to be weighed up in the context of the previous 2 years, which showed an audited and signed-off result of $7.2 billion of deficits, the vast majority of which was overseen by the previous Labor government. And Mr Parker talked about the government using unreasonable assumptions to inflate the unfunded liability. Well, I can give you one example of where those assumptions were particularly unreasonable under the Labor government. Despite medical and rehabilitation inflation going well above CPI, CPI was the only thing used to measure cost increases, and that had the impact of severely dampening down the unfunded liability, and it just could not continue. The chickens came home to roost when the revaluation occurred, and that's what we saw, a sort of a blowout of about $10 billion in a couple of years. So no one who knows about ACC can place any sort of credence on the assertions by Labor and Mr Parker that ACC's financial position over the last few years has been anything other than very tenuous and did require the sort of remedial action that this government has put in place. So I'm delighted to see that in such a short period of time the message about improvements and performance has not only been received and understood, but actively and enthusiastically supported by the staff at ACC. And the most pleasing aspects of the sorts of performance indicators the Minister was talking about in Estimates Review last week, I think, was around rehabilitation performance. He gave us an update for 11 of the last 12 months, and we saw some tanking performance in terms of outcomes rehabilitation between 2008 and 2009. 10-week exit rate was below 65%. They set themselves a quite ambitious target of 69% and are now tracking at about 71%, well ahead of their target. For the 9-month exit rate, they were down as low as 89%. I think set a target of 91.5%. They're now at 93%. What does that actually mean? Well, what it means is there are far fewer people going into long-term claims. And the rehabilitation performance for long-term claims has dropped by about 14,700 to 13.5. And those sorts of numbers have very, very significant impact on the corporation's financial performance. Now, investment performance has been talked about a lot, and the corporation has consistently performed above the benchmarks for the market. Even when it made losses in the 2008 year, they were still performing well ahead of the general average and against their budget. So it simply isn't true to say that this massive dip in financial performance by ACC in 07 and 08 was somehow, 08 and 09, was somehow the result of the dip in investment performance. Yeah, there was a little bit of that, but it certainly wasn't the material factor. And I think the warning bell that should be sounded around that is the fact that the Minister advised the committee that while it's looking pretty strong over the year, there was about a $150 million dip in returns in the last reported month. So that recovery in terms of investment performance is still pretty lumpy. But overall, Mr Chairman, I think this is a very, very good news story. People should not be fooled by the smokescreen that Labor continue to throw up in respect of ACC performance under their tenure. But there is a long way to go before we can achieve the sorts of stability that ACC deserves. And I look forward to that occurring.